Good morning, everyone. We have a pretty packed agenda for this webinar today, so I think we're going to get started now. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. My name is Romas Garbalauskas. I work at Conservation International, and I lead CI's participation in the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation, CPIC, and I'm also a longstanding member of the Conservation Finance Alliance, CFA. The focus of today's webinar, co-hosted by CPIC and CFA, is to hear from WWF about their experience implementing their guaranteed-backed lending for clean textile production blueprint in Turkey and replicating it in India, Vietnam, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Thailand. The blueprint was developed by CPIC's Green Infrastructure for Watershed Management Working Group, which is led by Karen Brand from WWF, who will be presenting on the blueprint today. Change slide, please. Brief word to those on the call who may be less familiar with CPIC. CPIC is a global multi-stakeholder platform focused on enabling conditions that support a material increase in private return-seeking investment in conservation. The coalition has grown from 30 to 85 members, including public and private investors, project developers, and conservation NGOs. Change slide, please. During the first few years, one of CPIC's primary activities has been to develop CPIC blueprints. A CPIC blueprint is a model financial transaction structure intended to help facilitate replicable investments in priority conservation projects. CPIC's 5 thematic working groups have been working from CPIC's early days in developing blueprints, with 12 having been developed and approved to date. All 12 are now available on the CPIC website in both short and long form. The current slide depicts the geography and theme for each blueprint. So with the first batch of blueprints available, the goal for CPIC is for the blueprints to be used to replicate the business and investment models described in the blueprints. During the most recent CPIC semi-annual meeting in January, we had a breakout session on the topic of blueprint replication, during which we learned that there are examples of where CPIC blueprints are being used for replication. That leads us to today's webinar with WWF presenting on using the CPIC blueprint to replicate their guaranteed-backed lending for textile production investment model beyond Turkey. I will, in a minute, turn it over to Jim Stevenson of Tyrannomics to speak generally about the process of using CPIC blueprints for replication. But first, I want to just briefly mention the Nature Plus Accelerator Fund, a private sector nature conservation accelerator fund developed by CPIC members IUCN and Morova Natural Capital, and anchored with funding from CPIC member, the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF. It is anticipated that this fund could be an important source of funding to proponents who are building new business and investment opportunities based on CPIC blueprints. I will now turn it over to Jim Stevenson.
Great, thank you very much, Romas, and yeah, thank you to the CFA and CPIC for inviting me to say a few words, and yeah, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. So I'm the director of Tyrannomics. We're a specialised consultancy focused on scaling up private investment in conservation and sustainable land use. The reason I've been invited to speak is over the past few years, we've been providing support to CPIC, both in the original development of guidance on blueprints, but also helping some project developers create blueprints themselves. So what I'm going to do, I'm a bit of a warm-up act to the main events of Kieran. So I'll be relatively quick, but just to offer some more colour on what the replication process is about and thoughts on how we can take it forward. So next slide, please. So Romas has done a great job at introducing the basics of what a CPIC blueprint is. To sort of click down on that another level, So there are four main elements to a CPIC blueprint. The first is providing an overview of the conservation need and opportunity, and CPIC as an organisation is really focused on the specific conservation outcomes that we can achieve here, and that's what we really see as the differentiator for CPIC, is that laser focus on biodiversity conservation. And also how the blueprint concept itself will contribute to addressing those conservation needs and towards conservation goals, targeting at least 2 to 3 key outcome indicators for conservation. And then some information about the business model behind the blueprint. So its organisation and governance, the products and services that are being sold, cash flows resulting from that, and commercial sustainability. Any external dependencies that the business model has on external regulation or policies, and issues around risk management. And then with that description of the business model, information on the investment model. So what are the financial instruments employed? What are their terms? What are the types of investors being targeted and their roles? Financial risk mitigation instruments like guarantees and insurance, the exit strategy that's employed, and any innovative features of the blueprint model. And recently, we've added a bit more to the template around specific features that allow for the model to be replicated. On the right-hand side of this slide, we have an example of the investment and operating model of one of the blueprints recently published from MB Community Forestry. The reason I've brought that up is I really see these graphical depictions of the transaction structure as being the heart of blueprints. These are the things that people can take a look at and ask themselves, is there a project or a landscape that we're working in where this transaction structure could apply? And so I've just highlighted that to give a bit more detail on what we mean by a transaction structure. Next slide, please. So why does CPIC have blueprints? So in the early years of the development of CPIC, the organisation asked itself, how do we progress from the situation where that we are in now, where we have a large number of individual innovative conservation investments, private conservation investments, maybe ranging in size between $1 to $5 to $10 million or slightly above. And how do we progress and aggregate towards transaction sizes that are more in the $100 million plus bracket? This famous figure that we hear about that triggers the interest of more mainstream investors. And one idea for that is, well, how can we actually accelerate replication to then aggregate similar transaction structures together, and maybe even work towards standardization of those transaction structures that, yes, can be adapted to local conditions, but are similar enough for financiers to really recognize and understand and model risk around and price. And the hope is that by doing that over time, we can move towards these larger scale asset classes. Now, this is very much an ambition and something that CPIC is trying to lead the way towards. It's certainly, I don't think, something that we have immediately in front of us, but this is sort of the medium to longer term goal that we have from blueprinting. Next slide, please. So within something called the CPIC Blueprint Development Guide that we helped to write a few years ago, we thought about what does the replication process look like, and we had identified 3 key steps, and these were developed in very much in the context of the CPIC process, where you have the working groups that Romas showed in the first slides, which are collections of organisations that come together, often sort of starting from a blank slate in terms of thinking about geographical focus areas or landscapes to target. Whereas I think for individual organisations or other collective groups that are taking this forward, it's possible that there are already specific projects and ideas that people have for replication. So just bear that in mind, I suppose, as we talk about it. These three key steps are looking at where are the conservation needs greatest, where is it commercially feasible to implement the blueprint, and also where is it socially and politically feasible. And I don't think these are necessarily sequential. Certainly number 2 and 3 I would see as being done together, but we've kind of separated them out just for ease of understanding. Next slide, please. So in terms of assessing where the conservation needs are greatest, so this is around, if we're looking at a global or regional level, or a common area of interest, we look at landscapes to assess, where is this blueprint actually relevant in addressing the conservation needs that we have. So is the blueprint model addressing the key drivers of ecosystem degradation that are relevant in those different landscapes? And from that, you have you create a short list of landscapes, and then looking at that short list of landscapes, it's then a process of prioritizing, where that blueprint could specifically address the conservation and restoration needs in those different landscapes. And if the organisations doing this are not conservation organisations, there's a range of existing, often public data sets and tools that can be used to help compare different landscapes and carry out that prioritisation of where the replication can really make the most impact. And also important in that consideration is assessing effectiveness of existing conservation efforts. We really see blueprints as adding value in areas where there isn't already effective conservation activity happening. If publicly funded conservation is already doing its job, you're unlikely to get much sort of incremental gain from trying to implement a CPIC blueprint. So the second, so the next slide, please. So in terms of assessing commercial feasibility, we don't suggest that detailed financial analysis is done at this stage. Instead, this is supposed to be a pretty quick assessment that just gives you a very high level view of whether this has any commercial legs at all. This kind of preliminary analysis is about looking at, is there early evidence of potential markets for the product or service that is being sold in this blueprint model? What is the supporting infrastructure to access markets? Is that landscape hundreds of thousands of miles away from a potential market? Is it near to a port or a major city or a neighbouring country that has a market for that service? What comparable offerings already exist? So this is a little bit of your competitor analysis. Are you going into a market that is already well served? And what some broad brush thinking around the scale of potential revenue that could be at play here. So if you have a very broad understanding of the size of a potential market, and you have a rough idea of the individual price of a service or product, you can begin to get a ballpark understanding of scales of revenue, and hopefully also some broad estimates of what costs might look like in that landscape. And the question that we identified in the guide was, how likely would it be that this model would break even within 5 years? And if the answer to that is there isn't a clear pathway, or you think it would struggle in that particular landscape or country, you can do one of two things: either say, okay, well, this probably isn't worth exploring further. Or it could be, if, for example, there was a really strong conservation need, how can the model be adapted? Because these blueprints are not set in stone. All of them are going to be adapted to some extent to work in different landscapes. So next slide, please. So thinking about where a blueprint is socially and politically feasible, maybe starting with one of the most obvious questions is, what is the local implementation capacity for that blueprint structure? Are there qualified and motivated partners that you could work with in implementing it? And what is the technical feasibility of doing this? Are there specific production methods promoted in the blueprint that are already adopted to some extent in the landscape or area you're looking at? Or would it involve introducing an entirely new production method? Things like, if it's an agroforestry based blueprint, is agroforestry reasonably implemented at the moment in that particular area? And then political support. So do the aims of the blueprint align with incentives and policies of government? Are there any prohibitive taxes or direct charges that happen? If the model relies on carbon financing, what are the revenue sharing arrangements around carbon financing? Are the legal frameworks supported? And then some of your typical country risk issues, like the significance of corruption, political stability. If the model relies on having relatively secure or clear land and resource tenure, does that exist? And are there significant social and environmental risks that could be an issue? And we suggest here, via a pretty high level review against a recognised framework like the IFC performance standards, or a relevant voluntary standard, and just thinking, can those risks be mitigated? So next slide, please. So how has the blueprinting replication process worked to date? So we have the blueprints on the CPIC website. I think we got the final ones up towards the latter stage of last year, and there has been some recent promotion of those on social media. Also, thanks to the work of South Pole and the team, we've got short versions of the blueprints that help make them more accessible. And some targeted support has been provided to help organisations develop blueprints, but not yet in replication. But regardless of that, we have seen some replication happen via word of mouth in the networks of CPIC members and informal collaborations. And that means at the moment, to our knowledge, we just have a handful of cases of replication to date. So next slide, please. So what more can we do in the future to support the replication process? So more active outreach and communications, and today is an example of that. Looking at the potential to work with partners to actually resource replication support, so provide some of that dedicated support to the replication process. Some targeted engagement in key regions. So more broadly, CPIC has been looking at how they increase engagement directly in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Asia Pacific, and more. And how do we also do that in the blueprint promotion and replication process? And sharing the blueprinting approach with other incubators, accelerators, and those potential linkages to the Nature Plus Accelerator Fund that Ramas mentioned. So I'll stop there and hand over to Kieran.
Fantastic, thanks, Jim. I'm going to share my screen quickly. Hopefully you can see it okay. Great, so welcome everyone. My name is Kieran Brandt. I'm from WWF Netherlands. My role in the group is I lead the bankable or investable focus group in the freshwater program, really looking for bankable opportunities in the wash sectors. But then also within the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, I support Africa as the regional lead to go and get a strong pipeline or investable ideas into the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development in order to go and get them supported and invested over time. And I can talk a little bit about that later. But today I really want to sort of focus a little bit on what we did in Turkey a while back and what our follow-up actions with that Turkey case are. Overall, I think this whole blueprint guide and this blueprint repository is enormously helpful, and it's something that we get asked a lot around. Do we have models? Do we have ideas? We need to do things locally. We need to have these projects with a biodiversity impact, and generally across the board, there are really great ideas and great models that exist out there that just don't always exist in each landscape or region. And having somewhere that we can go and start collating these models and these approaches in order to go and deliver to these local landscapes for them to go and see what has been done elsewhere so they can go and tweak that and implement that locally is really helpful. That local context piece, I think, is incredibly important. We can't copy and paste these things very easily and quickly, and we really need to make sure that we are deploying the right model in the right landscape. And I think in this case, we took a fairly known model within the textile industry. We tried to apply it to the Turkey landscape, and we got some really great learnings and really great impacts out of it. It was definitely not a copy and paste version of what existed originally, but it really was a discussion and a journey to go and understand what we can be inspired by and what we can go and really come up with from a very innovative and creative perspective to go and get this to land properly in each of the landscapes. And then also along that way, a lot of learnings and a lot of knowledge around what went well and what went badly. Overall, I think water is generally one of the more interesting and also one of the more difficult themes when it comes to these sort of impact investment, private investment opportunities. There needs to be a really strong focus on the landscape approach and the basin approach. Collective action and water stewardship become very important and very key to getting these things off the ground. And then also a strong partnership with the public sector and the private sector is important. Regarding the private sector, really understanding their role in these different investments is key, because the private sector can't do it alone, but it's also very important to have them on board. And so overall, I think this Turkey example is a fairly good overview on how that journey went for us, and also how we are going and moving to that next phase of replicating and expanding it. I will go through a bit of the background and how we approached it. I'll try to be as blunt and transparent as possible, but there are a few things that we can't share publicly yet. But then also, I think having the discussion around what went well and what didn't go well, I think is incredibly important, because it's something that is not always communicated and shared, but is sometimes very important when it comes to understanding these different models. So I think a quick overview on that textile industry. I think most of you will probably know that the textile industry uses a vast amount of water, all the way from dyeing and finishing, which is definitely one of the more large consumers in the whole supply chain. When you look at the water piece, I think between 95 and 400 liters of water is needed to create 1 kilogram of textile products. And so it's a very, very water intensive process, with a huge amount of chemical consumption, wastewater that's been created. Energy is a very important piece to this puzzle. And there's a lot of other things like odor which come into place, which is really important to go and understand the whole supply chain of this industry, as well as all of the different economic, social, and environmental impacts along the way. The textile industry has been quite a big focus within WWF, and we have a whole group looking at it and working with the textile industry. And we really see pollution and waste as largely a result of inefficient and ineffective use of resources and production processes. And so really moving to that cleaner production aims to go and solve these problems, not only by reducing waste generation, but also by providing a very important economic benefit. And I think those three pillars that Jim was referring to can be shown fairly well in this example. What we did was we really focused on a landscape or basin, which in this case is Buyuk, Menderes in Turkey. This is a very important river basin in Turkey and is a very important role from a biodiversity perspective as well as from a textile perspective. A lot of the manufacturing of cotton and leather happens in this region, and obviously a lot of negative effects around that. But also importantly, there are 3 important wetlands and 5 national parks in the region. And from a biodiversity perspective, there's a lot of key species, including the Dalmatian pelican, which live and which are really needing this landscape to be protected. Coupled with that, we have 3 big towns, Aden, Denizli, and Uşak, which collectively have about 2.5 million inhabitants. And the social aspects of this landscape is also really important. When we look at this very graphic photo of the region, you can see that the effect that the textile industry can have on the landscape, where the water literally runs red depending on the season. And so this is obviously a very key landscape to WWF, and this is where we've been implementing a lot of water stewardship type approaches, especially around the textile industry. Overall, Denizli, which was the focus for this piece of work, creates up to 60% of the national home textile exports. And so it's a very key area and key hub when it comes to the textile industry. But it's also somewhere that we have been working with a lot in the past, and we have those very important relationships with the different groups that makes going through this whole process quite a lot easier. When we look at our overall strategy within WWF, we have these 3 pillars. The first is obviously to really improve the water quality from a low to good status. We have some fairly good M&E when it comes to the water quality, and there is some very strong and very high impacts with regards to it. A lot of dilution happens along the way, but by the time it hits the delta, there tends to be a very low water quality overall. There are a lot of downstream consumers that need that water to be clear, but also obviously the natural focus along the way. It's really important to go and understand all the different impacts when it comes to water quality and how we can go and move that needle to good overall. We're also looking to go and create these basin-wide partnerships with a focus on biodiversity and a sort of reduction of resource use in production and in industry when it comes to the region. These platforms that have been set up and these multi-stakeholder groups that we engage with are incredibly important in the groups understanding the landscape, but then also understanding their impacts and potential roles they can play to reducing those impacts in the long term. And then lastly, making sure that we can really start building more protection, more resilience to freshwater habitats for people and for nature. When we started down this path of looking at certain ideas and certain interventions that could take place within the region, the textile industry obviously came up quite high. And we started to look at all the different models and all the different pilots that have been done in the space. Internationally, there are a lot of really great examples of cleaner textile production models. One of the ones that we used a lot of was the PACT example from IFC that was done in Bangladesh. This was a very helpful resource for us to start with and really build that foundation to what we should be working towards. But then locally as well, to really go and see what's been done locally in the past and what we can go and build off. And in this case, there's been some really great pilots in the region showing the potential of that shift to cleaner production, and very importantly, what the financial impacts could be. In this case, through a change in chemicals used, improved or modified equipment, increase in automation, improved maintenance and monitoring, and very importantly, outflow and treatment recovery, we can see with an investment of about 90K, we're going to be saving about 200,000 euros per year per site, which is a really great payback period. But then also the potential for a lower impact for each of these sites is massive. And so taking these global models, seeing the local context and what has been done locally, and then starting to go and engage these different groups was very important for us to go and understand what that final model would be for the region. Looking at these numbers, it always looks like it's very much a no-brainer for these investments to be made. And in many cases, when we go and talk to the producers on the ground, they generally aren't aware that these kind of options exist. Each facility tends to be quite unique. and the switch may not come from a single supplier, so it's very difficult for them to know exactly how much they can save, but then also which suppliers that are available in the region. Unless they literally knock on their doors, a lot of these producers won't really know what's possible out there. Lastly, the textile industry is a very big and very important established group in Turkey, but there's a lot of wariness when it comes to investments, since it's a very cost-driven industry, and buyers are able to really go and switch from one producer to another producer almost on a monthly basis. And so any upfront investment does worry these sites quite a lot. Lastly, COVID has, as with everything, caused a lot of hiccups in this model. We can go through a bit of the COVID impacts later on if needed, but I think COVID has really shown us what that worst case scenario when it comes to textile industry impact could look like, and how resilient these kind of investments are in that case. And so I think COVID has been something that has brought a lot of delays to it, but it also goes and shows us a lot of opportunities for these kind of investments. Overall, WWF created a program to go and enable keener production in this region through creating awareness and engaging all of these stakeholders to really go and catalyze these investments with the use of grants. We really started by creating a framework on best practices in the industry, and this was done through partners from the private sector, academia, and public institutions. And then with the support of grants, feasibility studies were done in about 14 factories, which have increased over time. We're really working with the private sector to go and understand all the different financial elements of the whole process, as well as the industry. We need to go and understand the different roles the private sector can play with the global brands, as well as from the local producers, but then also understanding the different hurdles that are preventing these investments from being made and how we can potentially overcome those hurdles. And so this has really led us to an approach that really was focusing on ensuring that the right investments are being made at the site level and how we can go and facilitate those. Overall, if you go and scale that up to a basin level, you start to see that with an investment of $5 to $14 million, you can start to see an annual savings of between $5 and $12 million a year, which is a really healthy payback period. And a lot of the time, these investments can take place with existing capital from the local SMEs, if available. If there's no capital available, looking for loans to each of these different SMEs is important, or because they exist within these industrial parks, you could potentially have credit lines being made available to groups of SMEs. And so there are a lot of different investment mechanisms that could take place in order to do this. And this will be very much based on the local context, whether or not they exist in these different IPs, if single brands have multiple supplies that they can go and bring together, or if everyone operates on a very case-by-case or individual status. But overall, from a ticket size perspective, there seems to be a healthy ticket size for this investment from that basin level. Looking at the impact, which obviously I'll try to keep to a minimum, but we're really seeing that this kind of approach has and should really be driving improved water quality and ecosystem for aquatic species, looking at the different water and food security impacts to really go and focus on that improvement to human health. Looking for that sustainable tourism in the basin, which obviously at the moment is very much being hit by COVID, but then also looking at those sustained long-term outcomes due to improved water governance, and then obviously the increased competitive in the local textile industry. This example is something that can really go and move an industry towards the right place, but it can also go and change the focus and change the direction based on what kind of interventions and investments are made. If I quickly show you this slide, and what I basically did here was I took a sort of snapshot of our pre-feasibility studies with all the different techniques and technologies on the top, just to really go and show that every site tends to be quite unique. And this makes the investment quite difficult. There is no single supplier that we can engage to go and deliver all of these interventions. And each of the different payback periods and impacts will be very, very site unique. And so there is not a single basket that can be delivered to each of the different groups. And coupled with that, as you saw in the last slides, sometimes 95% of the savings come through energy use. And when you have one major driver to the economic factors of the model, you might see that some of these producers will go and maximize their energy savings over the water impacts or social impacts. And so making sure that they implement the whole basket of investments as opposed to the ones that have the highest payback period is quite a challenge when it comes to these kind of models. And also it starts to show what kind of financial mechanisms you can set up in the long term. Overall, the model was quite simple, and this is definitely something that can be improved over time. But basically, with grant support from development organizations, as well as the different brands and buyers groups, we can go and carry out pre-feasibilities and feasibility studies on each of these sites in order for them to really go and understand what kind of investments they need, as well as what kind of impacts financially and from an impact perspective they can go and see in the long term. These studies generally cost between $5,000 and $15,000 US per site, and they will go and yield ticket sizes of between 100 and 200K per site. And so it's really about 8% in grant needed to go and get these investments off the ground. And generally, once you can show these different factories and producers what their site actually could look like and could really benefit from, that's when they really get on board and they start having these very constructive and very helpful conversations to go and move to that cleaner production future. Importantly, with financial and guarantee support from the brands and the local banks, these factories can then go and make those investments with those different paybacks. And this, I think, was taken in April 2019, but tracking these investments was very, very difficult, and we tend to have to wait for these big milestone events. And so in April 2019, we had a big brand session where it was announced that overall $6.5 million worth of investments have been made in the basin around these cleaner production technologies. And since then, we've been working with our partners to really go and understand the additional investments that have been made, but also importantly, what has prevented the rest of the groups from not making the full investments, trying to move towards that $14 million number. Overall, some of these are public and some of these are not public, unfortunately, but there are some very good and broad lessons we can talk about. But then also, you know, the constant driving and the constant focus on this kind of model is really important over time, because it'll never happen all at once. And it's great that we have someone like WWF in this region to really go and support this model to be implemented at every session and at every meeting, and can really go and drive this over time. Looking back at this sort of process, as well as what we can do next, the really big and the very large learning around this is around the different stakeholders. When you're working with a huge array of groups from public, civil, and private sectors, you start to see the complexity of your project ramp up quite quickly. And as I mentioned, I think WWF is in a very fortunate position to have a fairly good relationship with all of those different groups. And so we're able to go and activate them and bring them around the table quite quickly. That said, getting them all to agree and getting them all to work together is something that takes a lot of nuance, takes a lot of time. And especially when you're looking at a basin or industry level, it's important to be able to go and engage them as a private sector group, even at the basin and industry level, even though they may have a small part in the whole process. And so having those different engagements with the right narrative and the right focus is really important. But then also going and taking all of that to go and understand the different connections and value chains in the basin and in the landscape and industry is key. And then also looking at what we can do and how we can leverage groups like global brands and regional development banks, because without them, this project would not have been able to get off the ground. On the financial side, we had two very broad learnings. The first was that it was very difficult to get everyone to agree to rates. This didn't really surprise us, but the lending rates were always too high for the SMEs and too low for the banks. And this really highlighted the need for a strong financial model behind the approach in order to go and bring these different partners around the table, but then also to go and make sure that we had key and strategic meetings with champions and industry leaders, so that we could have those very blunt and transparent discussions, and we can go and start using them to go and move forward with these sensitive discussions like rates. Lastly, getting the right data was key, but but then obviously a lot of this data is sensitive. And so trying to access the right data and understanding what we can and can't share is really, really important. But all of that building into that financial model was a really good and really helpful step for us. And that's a step that we want to go and strengthen in the longer term. One of the other learnings was around the monitoring and evaluations of the project. Tracking the investments was incredibly difficult, and it's something that we have a lot of learnings from. But I think M&E in general is something that really struggles in these kind of programs and in these kind of projects. And so really making sure that we have a strong process around M&E, but also importantly, if we start to move towards these blended structures and these blended instruments, to make sure that M&E is a key part of it. When we started having these discussions with the different groups, when you start having those discussions about rates, they tend to forget the grant support and the pre-feasibility support they got early on. And so when they're looking at the rates, they're really looking at future investments without the benefits that they've already got. And so linking the pre-feasibility support with the investment in a stronger way is important. But then also making sure that there is a strong M&E element in order to go and keep people on the right path and be able to go and report back on the impacts. This example was something that I think was very much a no-brainer when it came to scaling and replicating it. In Turkey, the Ergene region, which is just above Buyuk Menderes, has up to 10 times the amount of dye factories. And so all the numbers you've seen today can be replicated 10 times over quite easily. But then also cleaner production in general is something that has a global benefit. I won't go through these slides in detail, but looking across all the different regions from developing to developed countries, there is a really strong focus and a strong benefit to this shift to cleaner production. Having a strong national and regional governance process and policy in place is very important, and having those landscape actors can really be helpful there. But obviously within the Asian context, this is a model that can go and really be focused and delivered in a lot of these Asian regions quite easily. But then obviously also LAC and Africa has a lot of potential for them. What we've decided really coming out of that look back session is to start to create a toolkit in order to go and scale this program within Turkey as well as within other regions. As I mentioned before, we really built this toolkit with the support of other people's work and other people's models out there like PACT. And so we really want to go and create content and support for those groups and other groups to be able to go along a similar journey. And so this is something that we're going to bring together within a digital toolkit. We really want to go and focus on how that journey that we went on and all the different lessons along the way, and also how we can go and strengthen this implementation in Buyuk Menderes, but then also go and scale it within Turkey and to the other regions and countries. One of the things everyone keeps asking us is what failed, what didn't work, what didn't go well. And that is something that I mentioned before that is generally not shown very often. And so we're really trying to go and capture that as well as the whole journey that we went through with this model. And then to go and create that digital toolkit and figure out what's the best way to go and deliver it, whether it's going to be through webinars, workshops, or e-learnings. Once again, COVID has delayed this piece quite a lot. And so we're hoping to finalize it in Q4 this year or potentially Q1 next year. But this is a piece of work that we're hoping to go and really go and take that blueprint, scale it to Turkey, strengthen the example in Buyuk Menderes, and then hopefully go and provide some content and some process for it to be done in other regions through our local offices, but also obviously internationally, whether people are affiliated with WWF or not. Very importantly, this whole piece of work was made possible through our partnerships, and is, I think the GECA, which is the local development agency, as well as the Denizli different groups, is incredibly important to go and get these off the ground. These groups have been really instrumental in supporting us. The Chamber of Commerce was really helpful when it came to bringing a lot of the different players around the table, but then also the global brands have supported our office in this work, as well as the different projects around this. And so H&M and the Tommy Hilfiger Foundation have really been pivotal to it. And then also, obviously, lastly, WWF-Turkey has been incredibly key in getting this work done. I've had the pleasure of being able to go and support them and help them from afar, as well as pre-COVID having a few really great trips to Turkey. But it really has been through their hard work over many years that we got to this point. This is a bit of a shameless plug, but this kind of work is only made possible through grants and donor money. it looks really great, and I think in this case, there's a strong opportunity for us to go and package the pre-feasibility work into the investments. But there's a whole bunch of work that needs to happen on the landscape and the basin levels. And so really engaging with organizations that are working at that level is key, but then also looking at the different funds and facilities out there in order to go and strengthen that, like the WWF DFCD, who we have that consortium of 4 partners with. These are incredibly great tools to go and get this kind of work done, because it's not something that you can do very easily in after hours. But I think with CPIC blueprints, as well as financial support from these kind of facilities, it's really helping us really to go and further these ideas, to get them built, to get them implemented, and to get them started. WWF has also gone and created a quick blueprint guide on some of the bankable nature solutions that we've seen around the world. This is a lot more visual and a lot more pictorial, and so I think the CPIC piece goes very well on the technical side. But this report is quite nice, just to go and get the interest of people, to go and show them the possibilities out there, and then obviously to go and lead them to these blueprints, because there's always that next step, and there's always that next meeting to go and get more information to go and scale and replicate these ones. So overall, I think that is it from me. We can definitely ask some questions and answers. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and let Kumar share the slides again. But I think that is a very brief and a very quick overview of what we've done in the last 3 years within the Turkey example. And then I think also very importantly, how this blueprint, I think, has helped us to go and get other blueprints, and how we sort of fed that back into CPIC, and how hopefully we can start to see that scaling and replicating of the blueprints, and creating more content around that. I think the way that CPIC is doing these blueprints is very, very helpful. There's definitely a need for more of them, and there's definitely a lot of examples out there that can go and get captured in the sort of blueprint guide. And I think if we can get as many different examples and as many different groups around the table to go and share these and have these very open and honest discussions around blueprints, we could start to really kick off that replicating and expanding of these blueprints into other landscapes, other regions, and other industries. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Karen, for the excellent presentation. So the final slide here is a thank you slide, but it also contains some important links. And Christina is also posting them to the chat box as well. The first link is to the blueprints themselves. There you will find the 12 blueprints in both short and long form, but also the blueprint guide. So the guide basically on how to develop a blueprint and how to replicate as well, which Jim spoke to. Second link is to the Nature Plus Accelerator Fund that was mentioned. I mentioned it and Jim mentioned it as well. And then if you are interested in learning more about blueprints or develop one, then please get in touch with CPIC at the email address here. So we can move on to questions. There are a few questions posted in the chat box, but I'll also start looking at whether or not any participants are raising their hands. And what I'll do is I will read the question from the chat box, but then turn it over to the people who posed those to see if they'd like to add. So first was kind of, and I think this one is more directed to Jim, and it was Gray Macquarie and LADB were asking questions in the Blueprint Development Guide about the 5-year kind of break-even rule of thumb that was used for kind of the commercial success of the underlying business model. And so maybe Gray, I think, posted it first. And so I don't know if Gray, you want to speak to that further. And then Jim, you can maybe speak to how, what the thinking was behind the 5-year break-even rule.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think much of it's clear. I just think that particularly when it comes to landscape level investments, a lot of these things are much longer term. And yeah, well, I think that obviously, in this case, it was quite clear how it was that you could get a return on investment quite rapidly and be within your 5-year horizon. I think particularly when it comes to African level landscapes, that's going to be a lot harder to achieve. And I was just wondering about whether it was looked at in terms of getting debt finance support from a development finance institution in order to sort of offset longer term return on investments and allow for shorter term ROI for private sector investment?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And yeah, maybe I'll start with a clarification and then expand on it a little more. So the 5-year guidance was for the break even of the business itself, as opposed to the investment. So it's not about a ROI on investment, but just on the profit and loss of the business itself. I think as Ramesh described it, it was put out there as a rule of thumb. There will certainly always be exceptions, even to that break-even point for individual businesses, depending on what type of business and industry it's in. I think the broad thinking was that if we're targeting concessional investment, maybe with a 10-year, 12-year or more return on investment, then the underlying business itself should be looking to break even within around 5 years. That's, for example, the type of model that the Kamasa blueprint has with forestry, which is probably at the upper end when we in different industries when we talk about break even. But yeah, certainly at a landscape level, if it is a landscape level concept, then there will also be a longer lead in and longer timeframes as well. So in conclusion, we don't want to place sort of too much emphasis on that 5-year number. It's really sort of to just get people thinking. But it's not intended as an ROI. It's a business break even.
Maybe if I can also add a few things to that. I think it's something that comes up a lot. I think the magic number is of what we find, especially within the African region, is 8 years, and below 8 years, it's quite easy, relatively easy to finance, and above 8 years is really, really difficult. But I think one of the important things is around that sort of exit strategy for the different investors, and where the investors come on board is important, because they'll tend to want that 5-year return on investment. And a lot of the time, there might be a lot of work that's been done prior to that investment that has given that project a bit of a head start in order to go and achieve that. So I think that 5-year piece is also not something that starts on day one when there's a sort of high-level model or a high-level idea, but it can come in throughout that whole process.
Yeah, thank you, Jim and Karen. Let me move to another question from Ella DB, and it's about how, one second, please. How were you able to offer low rates to the SMEs using blended finance? Did you use guarantees as well in the model? Ella, I'd invite you to unmute and elaborate on that question, and then I think that question is for Karen.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard that the rates were an issue where you were too large for the enterprises, too small for the banks. And how do you come to a rate that worked in the market without distorting the markets necessarily? And what instruments were you able to use in your model? And that's why I threw out the guarantee question as well. Thank you.
No, great. So in this example, that came from a few places. I think the first is around the role of the brands and their roles in off-taker and guarantor when it came to these loans, but then also understanding what kind of development support is available in the region, especially when it comes to impact-focused investments. And so being able to go and work with local banks to go and access some of this development finance enables those payback periods and those interest rates to be a bit lower. And so it really, I think, is a combination of both the role of the brands and off-takers, as well as getting some development finance to really go and help the local banks offer those local rates. but it is definitely something that I think is incredibly difficult, and the sort of follow-up process is really focusing a lot on that in order to come up with a model and an instrument that is easy to monitor and evaluate, but is also very transparent on all the support that's bundled into that deal, including the grants up front as well as the debts in the long term.
Great, thank you, Karen. I am looking for any hands raised, and I don't actually see any right now. I think maybe the best thing to do, if there are additional questions,
Sorry,
welcome people to. Sorry, Jim,
Ramos.
please.
Yeah, so I think I picked out a question from earlier on. I think someone was asking in terms of across the entire Blueprint portfolio, whether the Buyuk Menderes Blueprint was an outlier in terms of its the strength of the financial case compared to other blueprints in the portfolio. So I can speak to that briefly if it's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Please, Jim.
Okay. Yes, I think the Buyuk Menderes blueprint, along with one or two other blueprints, and particularly the blueprints that were created early on in the process, some of the US-based blueprints have got pretty strong, commercial returns associated with them in relative terms, in this world of conservation finance. And whereas I think the majority of the blueprints that we have in the portfolio, they don't have that level of strength of the financial case, and a number of them are quite early on in their development, so they're sort of they're at the pilot stage, testing innovative models, and it is difficult in this world to find that many. I think the phrase that was used was no-brainer models, and often they do have a reliance on blended finance, and Kieran was making the point about the critical role that grant finance has played in actually getting us to this stage with the Buyuk Menderes case. So yeah, those are just some thoughts on across the blueprint portfolio.
And maybe it's good to add that I think each of them comes with its own challenges and its own wins. And I think in this case, the payback period is amazing. And if you can replicate that, you're doing very well with other type of models. But then the complexity of stakeholders, as well as the smaller ticket sizes, is where the sort of the cons column starts to fill up. And so I think looking at it collectively, I think that this was quite a difficult one that can be very much improved on. And I think each of them will come with those very unique but very local context related challenges.
Great. Thank you to Jim and Karen. We're pretty much at time. And so I just want to close by saying thank you very much to both Karen and Jim for your presentations. So we have identified another proponent who has taken the environmental impact bond blueprint and has made attempts to replicate in the UK. So watch this space. We're planning another webinar on the replication of the environmental impact bond blueprint coming up soon. But thank you everybody for your participation in today's webinar, and by all means reach out to CPIC if there are additional interest in developing blueprints or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.